Hi, it's Kim from the Shamrock Quilt Studio, and today we're talking about EPP. Everything you need to know to get started on this project we're going to make. We'll be right back after this and make it happen. And welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Hi and welcome back. Today we're talking about EPP and everything you need to know to get started on our EPP project. I want to talk to you a little bit about the project, and then we're going to get into the real mechanics of how to make this happen. I just want to say, first of all, I hope this videotaping goes better. This is the third time I've recorded this. And we had camera issues one time, we had me issues another time, so I'm hoping that today, the third time, will be the charm. So, here's our fabric that we're using. We talked about this in another video. And so we'll be talking about our fabric today, our supplies, and then how we're actually going to get started. And I think we're going to work with this pink fabric today to get us started. Because it's very, I tell you what, I'm going to change my mind. We're going to go with this little light green because the thread that I have is hot pink, and that'll let it make it so that you can see it really clearly. Okay, so initially we talked about doing this pattern with a 60-degree angle diamond, and that makes a 6-point star. But we've decided to use the 45-degree diamond, and that will make an 8-point star. So I was a little concerned about the sharpness of this point and how that was going to work, because it is much more pointy than anything I've worked with before. But since I've done this 3 times, I've had a little bit of experience in making these. So let's just get started. These pieces came from Paper Piecing, and this is what they call, is it a large pack? Or, I don't think it's 450 pieces, so it's a lot of pieces. I think this ran me about $24, give or take, and they're all nicely in here. Small, compact container. It came in the mail, and it came really, really quickly. And then there's a little short instruction sheet that goes with it in case you find yourself stuck and you don't quite know where to go next, or you've forgotten what the next step is. So some of the tools that I use a hole punch, and what I use this hole punch for is to punch a hole in the middle of the paper piece, and that allows me to do a couple of things. Number one, I can pin through it to hold my fabric in place while I baste it, and I can use a crochet hook to pull the paper out when I'm done, and I'll show you that in a moment. Then I use little bulldog clips. You can also use the quilting, I think they call these binding clips, these little plastic ones. Either one of these will work. I just prefer this one. It's a little more durable, I think. It's a little bit small, a little bit smaller, and it is much cheaper. You can see I have a whole collection of these that I just use over and over again. They're easy to find. I find these can sometimes fall on the floor and you don't necessarily see them until you step on them. Okay. Beyond that, the next thing we need to know is how to cut our fabric. And like I said, I've done this a couple of times. So we're just going to cut right to the chase, pardon the pun. And we are going to cut a strip. Now, before I talked about this, and I said that the width of the paper this way, if we lay it straight across this, is almost 1.5, not quite 1.5. So if you need a 1/4 inch seam guide, that would be 2 inches. Well, I tried it in 2 inches and it's just a little fussy because it's a little bit small. So I decided to cut these at 2 1/8. So I'm going to cut a strip of fabric, and I'm going to demonstrate right here on this one. At 2 1/8, I'm going to turn it over because that side is a little frayed. 2 1/8. I think that blade is getting a little dull. So there's your piece, 2 1/8. And then we want to cut it so it kind of conforms with the shape of the project we're working on. I'm going to do this here with this ruler and the rotary blade, but in all honesty, usually what I do is I cut them on the fly with a pair of scissors because you don't have to be all that accurate. It is the seam allowance. Okay, so now we've got a piece of fabric that's roughly the shape of our diamond. And we're going to place the diamond right in the middle. And my preferred way of doing this is to use these little clips. And I clip it in the middle. And then I come to the point and I hold one piece down and fold the other one on top. And then I do that all the way around the piece. You want to keep that fabric really nice and tight. You don't want it to bend the paper, but you want it firm because the firmer you can have it folded over the paper, the neater your paper piece is going to look and the sharper your points will be. So now we have that piece clipped on all 4 sides. If you were using these, you would do that the same way. We'll swap out one of these. Usually when I'm working these, I will go through and I'll cut a bunch of cut a bunch of fabric the right size, and then I will clip them all. So I can sit there watching TV and fold it and clip it and fold it and clip it for 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever I'm feeling like at the time. And then I'll either immediately go into stitching them or I will hold them until the next time that I have a few minutes to sit down and sew and stitch them then. Now the reason we're stitching them is to baste them in place so we can remove the clip. Basting your pieces. There's a lot of ways that you could baste pieces. My preferred method is stitching, but let's talk a little bit about other methods. You can use a glue stick, and you would use the glue stick, get it open, and instead of clipping them, as you folded, you would glue either along the paper or right at the joints. I don't know how you would how you would glue right where they're folded together. I'm not sure how that holds, to be honest with you. I've also read that if you're glue basting, you should move into sewing them together pretty quickly. And that really doesn't fit the way that I do this. I'm not following a pattern where I know for the next row I need 4 blues and 3 greens and a purple. I'm creating a bunch of pieces and then I'm constructing those pieces into the design that I'm comfortable with, what I want it to look like. So I don't use glue basting, but a lot of people do. I also think it might be possible to use the applique glue where those fabric pieces come together, and that would give you a better chance of being able to let it sit longer and also pull out your papers without damaging it. Now, when we're talking about sewing them, stitch basting, There are some folks who sew through the papers, so they would sew here at the corner and they would knot it to begin with, and they would stitch right through the paper and all the layers of fabric, and then they would go to the next corner and do the same thing, and they're going through that paper that holds them. The problem with that is you have to clip your threads to be able to get your paper out, because if you try to pull the paper out, it's going to tear your paper or it's going to misshapen your shapes. My preferred method is to stitch. So how I stitch is I start here on this widest angle, not on the pointy angle, but the widest angle. And I take a needle and I just push through the bottom layer of thread and up through the top layer of thread and pull it through. I've got a knot on the end of the piece, so that's going to hold it. And then I'm going to make another stitch the same way through the bottom layer, out through the top, and now I've got a little circle, and I'm going to take my needle back through that little circle, that little loop, and that's going to create a kind of a little knot there. I did not stitch through the paper. Now I'm going to go to the next point. I'm going to hold those pieces together. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to come in here on the bottom piece and up through the top piece. We want to make sure that that thread stays on top of the fabric. And then we're going to go again, bottom piece up through the top piece. We've got a little loop, and we're going to come through that loop. We don't want to catch the ear there. And we've got another knot. Now this knot is not going to stay unless we keep this thread tight. But you see there we've got the little knot here. We've got the dog, pardon me. We've got the dog ear loose. Don't worry about that. That will sit nicely behind the next piece we sew to it. We're moving on now to our third angle. We're going to do the same thing, in through the bottom, out through the top. We're going to pull it snug. We don't want it to curl up, but we want it snug. You can use your little pinky there to hold it in place. Back again through, up through the circle. That creates our little snuggy knot. Last corner, and you guessed it, we're going to do the exact same thing. In through the bottom, out through the top. We're going to do it again, and we're going to go through the circle. Now, because this is going to be the last place we stitch on this, I'm going to do that one more time. So that gives us two pieces of thread pulling against each other to hold a little knot. We do not stitch here. Oops, we do not stitch here because we already have a knot here and here. So we have a knot on every corner, and it's just kind of a little pull against the fabric to hold it in place. And both dog ears are going this way. You want them to point in different directions, so when they sit together, they will lay right underneath the next one. And as we go along, and you keep doing that, you hide them, and then when you come to the very end, this one is going to go right underneath that one. So they will all come together very nicely. You just need to do it consistently with all of your pieces. So that's the basics of how you thread baste with EPP. Now, for our design, let's get started a little bit, shall we? We're going to start first with a little strip of this green fabric. Now I'll tell you, for EPP work, I do not pre-wash my fabrics. Usually when fabrics come from the store, they've got a finishing on them already. It makes it a little bit stiff, it keeps them nice and flat, they're easy to work with. It may be called a sizing. And a lot of people like to pre-wash their fabrics before they work with them. However, when you're working with EPP, being able to keep that fabric flat and being able to fold it over the paper and hold it tight is a real benefit. So because of that, I don't do it. I also like the consistency of all my fabrics kind of shrinking at the same time and doing that after I stitch them together. What I have done is if I have a fabric, let's say I have a very dark fabric that I'm working with along with some light fabrics and I think the color may transfer, I will wash that fabric in some cool water, not particularly cold, not particularly hot or warm, just kind of cool water. And then instead of putting it in the dryer, I'll just hang it to dry and that won't shrink it quite as much. Let me grab my ruler and we'll cut this. Okay, we're gonna cut this and I'm gonna cut it kind of backwards. The first thing we need is a straight perpendicular line. Whoops, and I didn't even cut that straight. There we go. Okay, so now we've got that line and we decided that we needed a 2 1/8 inch width. And if you've worked with hexes before, that'll seem pretty small. I usually use my wrist and my hand and then my elbow to hold this in place. You want to make sure that you're far enough away from that cutting area though that you don't cut yourself. That one cuts much better than the little one. I think it's time for a blade. Oops. Okay, so we've got that cut. We're going to put this away. We won't need that. So now we've got this long strip of fabric. If I can get it pulled apart. Normally when I'm working on this, I'd go ahead and cut the selvage off, but in this case, we don't need to. Let me get one of these out. I think you can also buy from Paper Pieces the little acrylic templates. I don't know if it made it into my videos or not. I bought these when I thought we were using the 60 degrees, and that would have made it really easy just to put this here and cut. And then cut and cut and cut. But this is the wrong shape for the one we're using. And I may go back and reorder that little piece, but all the other ones I've done, I haven't. So I'm not sure if I'm going to do that or not. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay this here in the middle. And then I'm going to mark that just a little bit bigger than 1/4 inch. And I'm going to cut. And then I can push this over. That's really awkward way to cut. And you know what they say, if it's awkward, you're probably going to cut yourself. But that gives you an idea. Now, just as easily, I could put this here. Once now I know about what that seam allowance is, I can cut. And that works just as well. It's not going to be as pretty of a line. It may not be exactly at the right angle. That one's not. But the more you work with it, and if I was working with it and not trying to put everything on camera, we would get much better results in our cut. And from there, you're going to just do what we talked about. You're going to start folding that around the paper. And we've already got that done. Now, I'm going to stitch this one while we chat a little bit, if I can find my needle and thread. It's been one of those days, people. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about EPP a little bit. When you're making an EPP quilt, the pieces are really small. And because the pieces are really small, you have lots of extra fabric because you have lots of seam allowances. That makes an EPP quilt a little heavier than a lot of quilts. An EPP quilt also will use more than likely a little more fabric than a regular quilt because of all those seam allowances. It's a lot more cutting because your pieces are small. You're not going to want to use, I don't think, as heavy of a batting if you're looking for a similar weight quilt, because you've got all that extra fabric. The actual top is more weight and warmth than a regular patchwork type quilt. The other thing I will tell you is when you wash them and they crinkle, they are some of the prettiest quilts if you like that crinkled look. I also find that because they typically, at least for mine, they're not quilted as heavily as some of the other ones. They're also some of the most comfortable quilts. They're the ones I want to snuggle up with on a Saturday afternoon. And just that quickly, there's another one done. You've got the stitching on the back. There it is. So now we can mix and match if we wanted to. And that's how that would be done. EPP is really easy. Some of the good points, I told you some of the bad points, some of the good points is you can take it anywhere. I can cut a stack of these fabrics and have a stack of papers and maybe a little smaller container of clips and a needle and thread, and I'm ready to go. I can take these anywhere and sew on them. It's also a great way to use your scraps. I have a couple of quilts that I've either all scraps or mostly scraps, and it's a great way to incorporate all those memories and use up material that you've already paid for that's sitting around. It's just really good for that. I find that it's easier for me to be creative with scraps in EPP than in some type of design or even something like a string quilt or just a crazy quilt where you're putting all your scraps together. For me, EPP is better to make use of those. So that's what I have today on our new project. It is going to take a while. I think we've covered that a couple of times. EPP is not fast. So I am probably going to be working on making maybe a dozen or more pieces of each of these colors, or maybe it's going to be whatever one strip makes. And I'll have some calculations for you on that as well next time. The last EPP quilt I did, I was able to, those were hexes. I was able to tell you how many hexes you got in each row of fabric. So if you're cutting it a certain length, how many that would be. I've seen some papers where they, you print out the papers and you cut them for the design. I will tell you, I've tried that. I did not find it very successful. I've also tried cutting my own hexes, and it was moderately successful, but it's very, very difficult to cut every single one exactly alike. And that is the benefit of ordering something that's manufactured on a machine that automatically does it the same way every time. Because when you get into situations where you're trying to match up one to the other, you're going to want that length to be the same. That makes it really easy. You can overcome it when it's a little bit smaller or a little bit larger, but it is so much easier when they're exactly the same. So I would recommend that. And you can buy smaller packets and you can make them in smaller batches and sew them together more frequently. You don't need to buy 450 at a time. For me, that's just easier because I can do 450 if I wanted to before I ever sewed anything together. Usually I do a batch and I put them together to get started to see if I like it, and then I keep growing from there. And in this particular design, I'm probably going to make that circle and then rows of circle out from there to build on the design. Thanks so much for joining us. I think we've covered some basics of EPP today, getting started with our new project. I hope you'll join us again. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing. You might want to check out our EPP playlist, and I have lots of other playlists on lots of other types of projects if you're interested. Thanks so much for joining us again, and we'll see you next time at the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Bye.